the deer and the antelope play, where seldom is heard a discouraging word, and the clouds are not cloudy all day. It's rather difficult to know how to start this. I have quite a lengthy undertaking ahead of me. I better make sure that my brain is in gear before I open my mouth. Your question, Timothy. What's it like to grow up on the prairie? That is a big question, and a good one. It could lead to broad avenues of talk and discussion, so I better be sure that my brain is in gear before I open my mouth. So here goes. Brrr. My motor is running. I'll pull the lever to engage my brains, and to my surprise, I have no brains. I remember the other day blowing my nose very hard. That's where my brains went. Or perhaps I lost them on the prairie. Years ago on the prairie, I overheard a man yelling to another man, "If your brain was dynamite, there wouldn't be enough there to blow your nose." Well, anyway, I have started. Thank you, Timothy, for a good question. The prairies are wide open spaces. Not only Saskatchewan, where I grew up, but also parts of Alberta and Manitoba and other parts of the world where children grow up into adulthood. I wasn't born on the prairies of Saskatchewan. I was only raised there. I was born in a country which is now known as Yugoslavia. Where I was born, there was no prairie. That part of the world would be similar to parts of Surrey Farms or Langley Farms. Their climate is the same as ours here in BC. My father died of TB when I was a baby. I know very little about my father. I was the fourth child born into that family. We were very hard up. My mother was left alone to raise and feed us children. Canada was widely advertised in that part of the world. Canada opened its doors to immigrants from all over the world to help develop it. One of my mother's sisters and her husband, whose name was Norick, moved to the prairies on a homestead in about 1905, before I was born. They liked it. They would tell my mother in their letters what it's like in Saskatchewan. Lots of tall grass or hay, big timber, open spaces. They were farming. They could turn their cows loose on the prairie at that time so they could graze all day. No one would bother them. Immigrants were given a homestead which consisted of 160 acres of land for $10. Do you know how much land that is? It is 1/2 mile square. That is a lot of land. But there were certain requirements before you could get clear title to that land. First, you must become a Canadian citizen. Second, you must build a house on it and live on that land for 3 years You must build a barn to house your livestock and dig a well. You must clear and plow no less than 10 acres. When all these requirements were fulfilled, you got clear title to that land. You could do anything you wanted with it. Sounds good and easy, isn't it? But it wasn't that easy for my mother. She was alone with children. Dad died. But my mother took that chance. She talked over with her parents. She sold everything she owned in Yugoslavia, bought a one-way ticket for herself and us children. Her parents did the same, and we took off for the wide open prairies in Saskatchewan. We landed in Plunkett, Saskatchewan in the fall of 1909. That winter, we stayed with my aunt and uncle John Norrick. They had a small two-room mud house with a barn attached to their house to keep their livestock. They had horses, cows, pigs, and chickens in it. And a lot of people lived with their livestock them days. They had no other choice. Help wasn't available. Besides, they couldn't afford to pay their hired help, so they built a barn to house their livestock. They may have had a table in the corner of the barn, slept in a manger or under the table. That reminds me of a case that your grandmother can tell you. The table was all set with a stack of pancakes, and a chicken jumped on the table and helped herself to the pancakes. Some barns had an upstairs. The livestock occupied the ground, while the owners lived upstairs. A story was also told. A health inspector came to a home like that and said to the woman, "Lady, we can't allow you to live like that. Why, it's not healthy. It's unsanitary." With all that stink, to which the woman replied, "Now look here, young man, we lived like this for years, and we ain't lost a pig yet." Those were the pioneer days. Many a tale and true story was told. Books have been written, the hardship and struggle they had to endure in the development of our great country. Some died of starvation, some froze to death. Many died of some ailment. There were no doctors. All babies were born in their own homes. There were no hospitals. My mother married again to a man who came from Poland. He had a homestead. He came to that part of a country a few years before us. He had enough improvements on his homestead so he could borrow some money from some mortgage company to build a one-room house so we have a place to live when he married my mother. He told us many a story what went through. He worked on the railroad that was being built for a few cents a day. When he got to know him, he had a cow, a team of oxen, a walking plow. He had a shotgun. Rabbits were plentiful. So were ducks and prairie chickens. He used to watch where the wild prairie chickens and ducks would nest. He would take their eggs and eat them. He preferred duck eggs. At times that is all he had to eat. Rabbits, wild ducks, chickens, He drank the milk. In the summer it would soon sour in the heat of the day. No one ever heard of a fridge. Milk was usually put in a covered pail and attached to a rope, then dropped down in a well to keep it cool. But it soon soured. When milk sours and solidifies, it is good to drink, very nourishing. That is, what he had to eat and live on. When he hitched his 2 oxen to the walking plow to break raw land so he could seed it to some type of grain. I recall of an occasion one evening as I sat on the hearth of our wood-burning stove, watching the sparks fly. All of a sudden, Mother starts to cry. Why? I must have been about 5 years old then. My 2 older brothers, John and Jim, were not home from school yet. However, when the family got together, Mother said, "We will have to send Jim and me to Aunt Mary's place as we have nothing to eat." They had no money. We were faced with starvation. So next morning, Jim and I were sent down the road to Aunt Mary's place. A distance, I would say, about 5 miles. All roads were only wagon trails around sloughs or hills when we knew the way. We arrived. Our aunt was surprised and asked, "Why, children, what brings you here all by yourselves?" The first thing I said, "Mother sent us as we have nothing to eat at home." How long we stayed at Aunt Mary's, I do not know. Neither do I know what they did to put food on the table. All I can say, they were very trying and difficult times. Not like it is now. If a person has nothing to eat and no money, a person can apply for welfare and society will see to it that you have enough to eat and a place to stay. But them days, Canada was a new country, and to my knowledge, welfare was not heard of. Not in our part of the world. If a relative or friend didn't offer you assistance, the end result was tragic. Yes, Timothy, that is what it was like on the prairie. I was a little boy depending on my parents for everything, just as you are. I had no choice. I had to go where my mother went. Had she taken me to perhaps to South America or any part of the world, I was totally dependent on her. She was a wonderful mother and a brave woman to do what she did. What she went through, the average person will never realize. The good Lord has already rewarded her efforts from her children and friends for remembering her as a loving, kind-hearted person. I will pass it on to my children, and you may my grandchildren. As a little boy, I can still remember walking over the hills looking for birds' nests. There were many sloughs with deep water, numerous ducks, gulls, hill divers, you name it. It was so much fun to look for their nests. It's quite different there now. More people have moved in, plowed the land, and seeded it to some type of grain. Birds' nests have been destroyed, trees have been chopped down and uprooted. Dry weather and high winds have blown the dirt off the plowed fields into the sloughs, reduced the depth of the water in these low places. We lived on a hill. In the spring, when all the snow melted, there was a large slough of water to the south of us. In the evening, when the cattle would come home, they would wade across the slough instead of walking around it. Their calves would follow, their legs were short. They swam. I almost drowned in that slough one day. We used to paddle in it every day. We got brave enough to walk across it. Then one day a boy and girl that lived to the east of us came over. We were going to show them that what we could do was a brave one, and I took the lead. But where we were going, it was a difficult part of the slough. The water was much deeper, and a dip in the ground where I was heading. As I stepped into this dip, I went under and couldn't get out. I kept jumping up, but I couldn't get out of this dip. Fortunately, my brother Jim was right behind me. As I jumped up, he grabbed my hand and pulled me out. I owe my life to Jim. Had he not been right behind me, I would have drowned. Then later on in years, I saved my brother Joe's life. He was a little guy about 3, 4 years old. We used to play in sloughs that had an uncovered well, which was about 10 feet deep on the edge of that slough. One day us kids were splashing around and I seen Joe fall headfirst into this well. I managed to catch his foot and pull him out. Had I not been there at that time, he would not be here today. There's a certain amount of danger for everyone, regardless of where you are. Where we were on the prairie, we didn't have cars crossing streets like you see every day now. Every now and then, someone gets killed. On the prairie, at that time, we would hear of someone being attacked by an enraged bull, a stallion, a cow defending her calf. I was attacked by a sow pig when she had young. I was kicked in the face by a horse. My mouth looked like 2 inflated tires. For days I couldn't open my mouth to eat. There's a certain amount of danger in every environment. We used to ride horseback. I cannot tell you how many times I had fallen off a horse. It hurt every time. One day I fell off a colt. That time my right arm was broken. What was it like to grow up on the prairie? Yes, it is a little different than it is here. At that time on the farm, everyone had horses for work. I grew up with them. They are domesticated, tame, but never trust a horse totally. They are big, very powerful, but very easily frightened. A little rustle of white paper, a mouse will frighten a horse. There is where most of the danger is involved. A person could be trampled to death in their attempt to run away. If they are hitched to a wagon or an implement and are frightened at times, it is impossible to hold them. They will run away and run over anything or anybody, break everything or anything that they are hitched to. I have experienced many a runaway with horses. Every runaway is costly in breakage. Every horse has a different disposition. Some are gentle, some are nervous, mean, will bite, kick. We had a horse that refused to be tied, regardless of the size of rope or halter. He would break it. We tied him with a logging chain to the manger. He couldn't tear the chain, but the manger couldn't hold him. He pulled it out of the barn. But he was a good horse, so we never attempted to tie him any more. He stayed in his own stall. When he was thirsty, he would go to the water tank at the well, have a drink, then go back in the barn in his stall. We had a horse that would turn to the left only. He could never be driven alone. He refused to turn to the right, so we had to put him in the center of the other horses so the way he was overpowered by the others to make a right turn. I drove as many as 12 horses on an implement. Can you imagine a little me with all that power in front? It wasn't easy. When we came to the end of the field to turn them around, it was hard. But we had no choice. Our tractor at that time had a broken crankshaft, so until the tractor was repaired, I struggled with 12 horses. To give you an estimation of what 12 horses could pull, I venture to say if they were hitched to this house you are living in, they would pull it off the foundation. Briefly, that is the strength of the horse. There is a lot involved in taking care of the horse. Feeding, housing, grooming, harnessing. Entirely different environment that you are now. When you get up in the morning, the first thing you do, you have breakfast. On the prairie, even when I was a little boy, the first thing I did when I got up in the morning, go to the barn, feed the livestock, clean the barn, milk the cows, harness the horses. Then I came in the house for breakfast. It would all depend on the time of the year. In the winter, there was no need of harnessing horses for work, but they had to be fed. I well recall how sleepy I was in the morning, but I had to get up, help with the chores, eat my breakfast, then walk 2 miles to school. It wasn't so bad in the spring and summer, but in the winter, extreme cold weather. How often the tip of my nose or my cheeks would be frozen. Likewise my feet and hands. Most of the time we're taken to school with a team of horses in extreme cold weather, but occasionally it wasn't convenient for my stepfather to come for us. He may have been off to town and was delayed then. The only way to get home is walk. At one time it snowed all day. When school was let out, there was no one to take us home. There was a high wind to face. Snow was deep. We started off walking. After walking about a half a mile, I could go in no further. I started to cry. My 2 older brothers were bigger and stronger. They couldn't carry me. There was a hill we had to go over. I thought, if there is no one on the other side of this hill to meet us, I knew I wouldn't walk the extra mile and have ahead of us. The wind was so strong, it was choking me. Then I really did cry. I felt that I had to lay down in the snow and freeze to death. Just then I seen a team of horses with a sleigh coming up the hill to meet us and take us home. I will never forget that day as long as I live. My face and hands and feet were frozen, took weeks to heal. I can still see the patches of skin that peeled off my feet. Yes, winters on the prairies are rough. There was another incident in my early years. It was late in the fall, bright, sunny day one morning. The three of us went to school barefooted. Them days all children went to school with bare feet. Parents had no money to buy shoes. Even adults walked around without shoes in the summer. It was a foreign custom. All of a sudden it clouded up and started to snow. By the time school was let out, ground was white with snow. I don't think we were the only ones there without shoes. I still can't see why the teacher let us walk home. She knew we hadn't to walk home too, and were barefooted. Anyway, we take off for home. After walking about 1 mile, our feet were cold. At that time, we used to go through Fred Lay's yard. He was your grandma's grandfather. When they seen us coming, they called us into their house, washed our feet, which were numb with cold. They gave us lunch, found some old socks and shoes, put them on, dressed us up, and sent us on our way. This is another deed of kindness that I will never forget as long as I live. I have told it over and over again. It was a loving act of God. All the people on the prairie were ready to help one another. We were miles apart, but everyone was ready and willing to be neighborly, and they still are that way. It seems when people are hard up and live far apart that they tend to give a helping hand. At that time on the prairie, people came from various parts of the world. To the north of us, where were living, was a colony of mostly Russian German. To the east, Ukrainian and some Polish. South of us was a large settlement of French and Hungarian. To the west, a lot of Swedish and Norwegian. Then right around our area were a lot of American that came from various parts of the USA. Also Scots and English. I recall going to school one summer. There was only one English-speaking boy. The rest were mostly Hungarian and French. A lot of the children couldn't speak English. At recess or noon, the children would speak their foreign language among themselves, which made it difficult for youngsters to learn English. So the teachers made a ruling. Anyone caught speaking another tongue got a spanking. This way, any beginners had a chance to learn English. None of the foreign children could speak fluent English. How often we would be in contact with children in the surrounding schools. None of the children of European parents could speak fluent English. When I started to go to school, I first had to learn to speak English. My older brothers, John and Jim, they too had a problem. But we had an advantage over others because our school children were American. The bulk of our neighbors came from the USA, Minnesota, Montana, North Dakota, etc. That's history now. As the children grew up into adulthood, they intermarried. They are all Canadian. They formed a new culture. This new generation now growing up forgets the old foreign ways of life. Speak English only. Change is gradual. I wonder what the next generation will be like. Perhaps I should tell you a little about the farm life, what it's like to grow up on a farm. I used to envy children that grew up in towns or cities. I thought they had more fun because youngsters could go out in the street, talk or play. We were all by ourselves on a lonely farm, miles from town. At times, days would go by. We wouldn't see a stranger. We would be so excited if someone drove into our yard, be it with a team of horses or perhaps a car. All of us would run to meet the visitor. Yes, prairie life is different, especially that time. We would get so excited when there was talk of going somewhere. We would count the days for that event. How well I recall that there was a sports day in town. I would get up in the morning. All I could think of, let's go. When we got there, we would buy an ice cream cone, a banana or an orange, a chocolate bar. Each of the items mentioned cost 5 cents. Money was our problem. The only way we could earn a few cents was bounty on gophers. Gophers were a menace on the farm. They would multiply so rapidly, dig holes in the grain fields, chew the stalks of grain right to the ground. They would have paths from one hole to another. To keep the gophers down, the municipality paid 2 cents bounty for each gopher that was destroyed. So us kids would trap them, shoot them, or even snare them and round them out of their holes. When the gopher was killed, its tail was cut off. When we'd have a few hundred gopher tails, they were taken to the municipal office, counted, and we got paid. That was our spending money. Very seldom that our parents gave us spending money. They didn't have any money. They may have a few dozen eggs to sell or a few pounds of butter that was taken to a local store, exchange for other essentials like sugar, salt, etc. They were always hard up and ready for cash. Where there is a big family, clothes are always needed, shoes, school supplies, machinery would break down. They had to be repaired. A farmer's main income is always in the fall of the year when the grain is harvested and sold. That means a farmer gets paid once a year. He has to be very careful how he spends his money so he has a little bit to spend till the next crops come around. The average worker that has a job gets paid at the end of the week or perhaps every second week. Now I'll ask you, Timothy, how would you like to get paid once a year? Well, that is farm life. Your biggest payment is in the fall. Perhaps I'm too serious in putting it in this way, but you ask the big question when you are wondering what it is like to grow up on the prairie. It's a different way of life altogether. The best way to find out Go and live there. Ask a lot of questions, and your understanding will broaden. Farm work is very important. It is mankind's food basket. If I would ask an average youngster, where do you get your milk from? They would say, we buy it in a store. It is right, only up to a point. But where does the storekeeper get it from? Likewise, when you eat a slice of bread, did you ever stop to think, what is bread made out of? That leather pair of shoes you may be wearing, where does leather come from? We could go on and on. Hundreds of items, they all point to the farm. And there are hundreds of farms on the prairie. Farm life is different now than it used to be. When I was a young lad, we had to work hard. We didn't have electricity. They have it now. We didn't hear of the word radio, TV, fridge, deep freeze. Or when we wanted a drink of water, now you go to turn on the water tap. Our drinking water came from a well. Most wells were quite a long way from the house. Water was carried to the house by a pail. For warm water to wash dishes, a kettle was used, which was always on the stove. Later in years, stoves had a reservoir attached to the side. It held about 2 pails of water. As long as there was heat in the stove, the water was warm. But when the fire in the stove went out, the water would soon be cold. There was a time in the winter. Winters were always cold. 3 of us older boys had to take turns in lighting fires in the morning. We were called about 6 o'clock in the morning, get up to light the fire in the stove. There were times so cold, water in the pail or water in the kettle on the stove was frozen. When our turn would come, we would have to have our kindling ready the night before. We would put the kindling in, light it with a match. When the fire was burning in the stove, we would hurry back into bed to get warm. All this was done in the dark. We had no electricity. It was our responsibility to refuel the stove every now and then so the house would be warm enough in about an hour so that the coal oil lamp was lit and everybody would get up and get dressed. Us boys would go to the barn, feed the horses, cows, pigs, chickens, milk the cows, then come in for breakfast, gulp our breakfast down, and get ready for school. Our school was about 2 miles away. In the winter, we were usually taken to school by sleigh, pulled by 2 horses. This would be our winter schedule. Summer was a little different. I recall one summer our pasture had no grass left. We had to take our cows about a mile every morning and later tether them out on a long chain on some company land. There was a lot of grass there for the cows to graze on. That was Jim's and my job. Every morning before we went to school, take the cows about a mile away, tether them out on a long chain, then go to school. After supper, go and bring them home for milking. We did have a little time every now and then for play. We would play hide and go seek. There were so many places to hide. Barns, granaries, trees. We always had a dog and a cat to play with. We made a harness for the dog, hitched him to a little wagon. What a time we would have. He was the laziest thing under the sun. He would walk a little way and lay down. We couldn't get him to move. We decided to cook him gopher soup. We killed the gopher, skinned it, boiled it in an old pot on a bonfire outside. We thought our dog will really enjoy that soup. We put a few vegetables in with it. We could hardly wait to watch him gulp it down. Then the moment came. It was cool. We handed it to him in his dish. He took a smell of it and walked away. We couldn't believe it. What a fussy dog. I put a slice of bread into his soup. He pulled the bread out. It kind of was reluctantly, licked his lips and lay down. I suppose he thought, some cooks. There are numerous things I can bring to mind. When I was a youngster on the prairie, we were all by ourselves, hills and sloughs to roam around on. We were always frightened by lightning and thunderstorms. The odd one got killed by lightning. Our neighbor's colt was struck by a bolt of lightning. We looked at it. Its hair was singed by the ray. The prairie is bad for lightning and thunderstorms. So many people would install lightning rods on their houses and barns for protection. We had a haystack of hay struck by lightning. It burnt. That was a big loss. The prairie is also bad for hail. At times, hailstones as large as golf balls. Breaks windows. We were hailed out twice. You couldn't find one stalk of grain standing. The leaves on trees were all stripped. Even the buildings were left with pot marks where the stones hit. Millions of dollars of damage. Older brother. The first time we were hailed out, I would say it was about $6,000 loss. That was a lot of money them days. We had no insurance. It only took a few minutes. You couldn't find one stalk of grain standing. It was all cut down. The second time we were hailed out, it was exactly on a 10-year cycle to the exact day. But this time, it was different. We learned a lesson. We had hail insurance this time. But to say something about a 10-year cycle, we had a calendar hanging on the wall that had the weather forecast on it for each day a whole year in advance. Those weather forecasts were based on a 10-year cycle. Them days, we had no weather forecast like we have now. Some people used to believe that the weather pattern repeats itself every 10 years. The weather forecasts on that calendar were wrong 90% of the time. But we being hailed out on the exact day and hour on a 10-year cycle was correct. Since we had insurance on our crop, we were well taken care of. We had a lot of land under crop them days, a lot of our horsepower. The first thing, we fenced the hail-damaged areas with electric fencer and turned all our cattle into the hailed areas for the stock to graze on what was left. And in the meantime, start plowing the hailed out areas for next year's crop. Since we had much to plow under, by the time we had it all plowed, there was a field of about 100 acres that was seeded to wheat. Was reviving so fast, we decided not to plow under, but see what it would do since the weather was so favorable. We were already compensated by the insurance company. It so happened that field of wheat brought us 20 bushels of wheat to the acre. which is considered as a fairly good average. We did very well this time. The first hailstorm was a complete loss because we had no insurance. The second time we learned a lesson by insuring and were paid twice on that one field. This happened when I was already a grown man in the early 1940s. I will now jump back to 1912, where we lived for a few years on my stepfather's homestead. We loved to kick footballs in school. At home we could take a bunch of rags, stick them into an old gunny sack, tie it with a piece of string, then use it as a football, and kick the daylights out of it. In no time it was all in pieces. We could make another one. On this occasion, Jim, my older brother, found a rock about the size of a football, stuffed it into an old bag, set it in front of the house. He shouts, "Come on, John, the football is ready." John was the oldest of us three. Barefoot, of course, we never wore shoes them days. He looked at that so-called football, took a run out of the house, kicked that rock with his bare foot. Now you can imagine what his toes looked like. Skin bleeding, he was screaming with pain. When Mother learned what had happened, she took after Jim. She couldn't catch him. He ran over the hill far away. It was getting dark. We had our supper. No sign of Jim. We all went to bed. No sign of Jim. I thought perhaps he's lost. Did some wild animal get him? Then I could hear a soft screech of a door. Jim is quietly coming in. He slept with me that time. All of a sudden he is by my bed undressing quietly. Next thing I knew, Mother heard him. Next thing, if we had a neighbor living a half a mile away, they would have heard him. He got a seat warming that he will never forget. I know he didn't realize what he was doing. Had he known the end result, he would not have done it. Learn while you're growing up. I learned a painful lesson that my two older brothers pulled on me. In the winter time on the prairie, it is extremely cold. The windows would be frosted over. To pick up a piece of metal with bare hands is dangerous and tragic. Skin on your hand will freeze to the metal instantly. To drop the metal results in your pulling the skin off from your hand. It is worse than picking up a hot iron which will burn you. One very cold day, the frost in the windows was white. No one could see through them to the outside. The hinges on the outside door likewise had frost on them. John and Jim told me to get down on my knees and lick that snow off the door hinges, which were white with frost. They told me it was sweet like sugar. It too is white. I fell for it. Got down on my knees to lick the bottom hinge. It was covered with white frost. The minute my lips and tongue touched the hinge, they froze to the hinge, and when I pulled away the skin off, my lips and tongue were frozen to the hinge. Let me tell you, that was painful. The boys got a spanking, but I suffered for days till my lips and tongue grew new skin. So now remember, if you ever go somewheres where it is extremely cold, never try to pick up a piece of iron with your bare hand. It is as bad or worse than picking up a red-hot iron. Children love sweets. Us kids had very little of it. Our parents couldn't afford the bare necessities of life, food and clothing. Candy, they couldn't afford it. I can still remember my grandmother walking over to our place. She would always have a candy for each of us kids. Only one for each. They lived a long way from our place, about as far, perhaps, as you from our home. It takes about a half hour to drive to your home by car. She always walked. It took her 3 to 4 hours. Then one day, my uncle came over to our home with a team of horses to tell us that Grandma is very sick. There were no doctors or hospitals to go to. She had very high blood pressure. In the old country where we came from, all doctoring was done by some old woman. The only remedy they had is some herbs that would be gathered in the woods. They were dried, stored away in case of some ailment. A tea was made out of those herbs. That was their only medicine. It wasn't long after that Grandma died. It was sad. No more candy for us kids. Not from Grandma, anyway. Our oldest brother, who died in the old country at the age of 7, had bad inflammation of his lower bowels. Every time he had a bowel movement, his whole lower bowel came out. What a painful problem they had to put it back in. He screamed with pain. Many youngsters them days died from that ailment. There were no doctors. He couldn't sleep. One old lady who did a lot of doctoring told Mother, "Make him a tea out of poppy leaves. That will put him to sleep." But she didn't tell her how strong a tea to make or how much to give him. So she made him a tea out of poppy leaves. It sure put him to sleep. He fell asleep immediately. He slept all that day and night. She couldn't awaken him in the morning. He slept another day and night. Next morning she had a hard time to awaken him. So remember, Timothy, if you can't sleep, make yourself a drink out of poppy leaves. If you make it strong enough, you may never awaken again. Shortly after Grandma's death, Grandpa died. It was late in the fall of the year. Ground was already frozen. They were thrashing them days. Grandpa drove a team of horses with a load of sheaves to be thrashed. Something went wrong at the thrashing machine that required immediate attention. Grandpa jumped off the load he was on to the frozen ground, a height perhaps 8 to 10 feet, ruptured something in his stomach. He died that same day. Sad, isn't it? It is written in the Bible, "It is appointed unto everyone to die." then cometh the judgment. After the funeral, whatever my grandparents had left behind was very little. Mother got a horse, their first horse. So far they only drove oxen. Some things were sold. The money was used to buy us kids clothes we were badly in need of. John and Jim each got a sweater. Shortly after that, the boys, John and Jim, were told to go and clean the pig barn. They left their sweaters in the barn. When they were finished, next day, Father found the sweaters in the pig barn. You can imagine what they looked like when the pigs were through with them. They were brought to the house with a fork. The pigs sure had a good sleep that night, but the boys, well, I don't think they slept very good that night. I recall going to school at an early age. My first task was to learn English. I played with two girls most of the time. Boys were too rough for me. Occasionally, some mother of their children would come to the school for some reason. One lady would pick me up and kiss me. I couldn't figure out why. I felt so little. In the warm of summer months, the boys would go swimming in a slough of water a short distance from the school. The slough was surrounded by trees. None of us had bathing suits. There was a big, strong lad, a strong swimmer. I could sit on his back while he swam the slough. I enjoyed that very much. One day we spotted two girls peeking through the trees at us. They were soon chased away. We would only do this during our lunch hour. On one occasion, a bunch of us kids ran over the hills a different direction. For some reason, I was all alone. I decided to follow them. It was a kind of wilderness. As I was walking over a hill, a huge badger just crawled out of a large hole. I have never seen a badger before. No doubt he was as frightened of me as I was of him. I can still see the hair stand up on his back. He spit and blew his nose at me with a very queer noise. I screamed with fright and ran back towards the school. I must have been very hysterical as soon as I seen a couple of older girls running towards me. They picked me up and wanted to know what was wrong. I couldn't express myself. I knew very little English. I have never seen a badger before, and I didn't know what that animal was called. How I remember the girls discussing this event between themselves. What could have frightened me? At recess, children in school soon get attached to friends that they are able to play with. There was a Swedish family living not far away from our place. We played together very much. They would come to our home to play with us boys. The oldest boy was older than my brother John. He used to come over to our place chewing tobacco. He would steal it from his father. He gave each of us boys a piece of it. We spit it out immediately. It tasted awful. he laughed his fool head off. Time and again he would come with different types of tobacco, also snuff. Try this. This is different. It's sweet like candy. I would fall for it again. Spit it out. He laughed again. All these boys chewed snuff, tobacco, smoked. Their parents spanked them for it. No use. They would be back at it again whenever they could. One day it was quite late in the fall of the year. Frosts on the night would soon put a stop to grass from growing. Them days grass was knee-high in the wide open prairies. One of these boys pulled a pile of grass with his hands, made a nice pile, then set it on fire. It soon spread as the wind blew against it. What a time we had to put it out. We had nothing to fight fire with. We were only kids. We each took our coats off and beat it with our coats to stop it. We won. It didn't get away. We put it out. It was the older boy that lit it. Then the younger lad took after his older brother, bigger than he was. He gave him a trouncing. Had it gone away with us, the whole neighborhood would have been burnt out. Prairie fires were bad them days. There was very little plowed land. How well I remember looking either way, smoke as high as I could see. A prairie fire miles wide. Haystacks, granaries, houses, barns, you name it. Burnt. No insurance them days. One such day, Mother and I were home alone. A high wind from the west. A prairie fire out of control and coming towards our place. Fortunately, they had quite a wide strip of land plowed to the west and north of our house. But to the south of the house was the barn with a lot of hay around it. The fire stopped at the plow land, but sparks flying high with the wind, fanning it, soon jumps fire guards. The fire swept through our yard, but fortunately Mother managed to keep it away from the hay and barn. The fire kept on going. Where it stopped, I don't know. Them were tragic times. It cannot be repeated again. All the prairie is plowed now. But there are other concerns. The boys that I have mentioned previously that we